Hi, and welcome to the Sword of St. Michael Network. My name is Farah, Sister Farah Rose Perry now, and I am enjoying our formation series with St. Ignatius of Loyola and Father Timothy Gallager in this Ignation Guide to Discernment of Spirits. This is incredibly powerful. If you are new, I know you're going to love this. We're all plagued from time to time within our job and our emotions and on our spiritual journey by the good spirits and the bad spirits, okay? Swords of St. Michael is here to help you learn all about deliverance, discernment, healing, exorcism, that sort of thing. So in this series, we are really diving deep. This week we're going to cover chapter 5, which is still going over the desolation, spiritual desolation. And we're going to basically talk about what it means to have the opportunity for fidelity, to actually look at what this opportunity when we're plagued by bad spirits can do for us. So don't go anywhere. As I was saying, welcome to the channel. I'm hoping you give this a thumbs up and a like, and leave me some comments down below on possibly some struggles you might have had or your thoughts on this chapter. This chapter really brought out some really recent stuff for me. And for those of you who are new here, this book is available on Amazon. You can get it on Kindle, I understand. Timothy Gallager, The Rules for Discernment of Spirits. And it's based on the Ignation rules for discerning the good spirits and bad spirits. This is so powerful. I think that even though this book was written for formation directors, which I'm a former Franciscan formation director, it was written for people that do spiritual retreats. It was written for those who are not only seeking a deeper relationship, but to understand the attacks that you might be going through. This is for everyone wanting to walk towards Christ and get a deeper understanding of some of the thoughts and emotions and things that are going to assail us, especially when we least expect it, spiritual desolation. So don't go anywhere. We're going to start with our St. Michael prayer as always. Give us a like and a thumbs up. Please subscribe and click that little bell button down there somewhere. We're going to go right to prayer. We're going to read the chapter, and we're going to talk about some of these amazing points that he makes that we can do in the fight in spiritual warfare in the Discernment of Spirits by St. Ignatius of Loyola. In nomine Patri et Filio et Spiritus Sancto, sic erat in principio et nunc et semper et saecula saeculorum. Sancta Michael Arcangele, defende nos in prelio, contra nequitiam et insidiis diaboliesto presidium, impedile Deus, supplicis de percamur tuque, princeps maletia celestis satana maliosque, spiritus malignos, qui ad perditionem animarum pervegantur in mundo divine virtute detrude. Amen. Our study prayer by St. Ignatius of Loyola, Suscipe. Suscipe Domini universum meam libertatem, accipe memoriam intellectum atque voluntatem omnem, quid abio ver possideo, mihi largitus es, et tibi totum rustitio, ac tui prorsus voluntati trabo gubernandum, amorem tui solum cum gratia, tui mihi dones, et tibi sum satis ecaluit quidquam ultra posco. Amen. Rule 5. Spiritual desolation, a time for fidelity. The title of the rules for the first 4 rules themselves are essentially instructive. Ignatius' goal thus far has been to familiarize us with the field in which discernment of spirits occurs. In his title, Ignatius establishes the basic paradigm of such discernment. Be aware, understand, and take action. The first two rules outline the action of the two spirits with respect to the fundamental direction of the person's spiritual life, moving away from God, Rule 1, or toward God, Rule 2. In the third and fourth rules, Ignatius describes the two interior movements we are able to discern: spiritual consolation, Rule 3, and spiritual desolation, Rule 4. At this point, we are initially equipped to be aware and to understand the movements of which we have become aware. We know what it means to be within and spiritually aware, and we can begin to understand which interior movements are spiritual consolation and which are spiritual desolation. Ignatius has not yet concluded the task of instructing us regarding discernment. More of such instruction lies ahead in the rules to follow. With the fifth rule, a shift occurs and the rules become predominantly normative, providing guidelines for action. As we become increasingly capable of noticing and understanding spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation, the third step in discernment rises ever more insistently to the fore. We desire counsel regarding how we may effectively take the spiritual action toward which the deepened awareness and understanding are directed. Consequently, we increasingly look to Ignatius for guidelines concerning how to accept faithfully the work of the good spirit in spiritual consolation, and how to reject efficaciously the work of the enemy in spiritual desolation. It is especially to this last point that Ignatius directs the remainder of the rules, that is, how to reject effectively the disheartening action of the enemy in spiritual desolation. Clearly, if we compare the action of the good spirit with that of the enemy, the first is by far the primary spiritual reality. In the history of salvation, communal and personal, the grace-giving action of God is the essential reality. Thus, the fundamental issue in discernment of spirits will always be to accept the work of God in time of spiritual consolation, to be strengthened by it as God intends, and so respond ever more fully to that divine love. And Ignatius will have further guidance to offer to this end. Ignatius writes these rules with an eminently practical purpose in mind. He dedicates the majority of them to assisting us in rejecting the pitfalls of spiritual desolation. There are, in fact, some concerns to be addressed with respect to spiritual consolation, but there are fewer than those regarding spiritual desolation. The greater difficulty lies in the trap of spiritual desolation and its power to debilitate. If we are not aware of it, we do not understand it, and we do not concretely know how to reject it. In terms of the basic paradigm of discernment, this signifies that the central focus will henceforth be the second half of the third step, how to reject the work of the enemy in time of spiritual desolation. We may represent this through recalling the basic paradigm and highlighting Ignatius' point of emphasis at this stage of his rules. Be aware, understand, and take action. Either accept or reject. From this point forward, Ignatius will present us with a wealth of practical counsel on how to overcome the deceptions of the enemy in spiritual desolation. The next four rules, 5 to 8, discuss rejecting such desolation when we are already within the time of spiritual desolation itself. They indicate what we should not do in time of spiritual desolation, rule number 5, and what we should do in time of spiritual desolation, rules 6, 7, and 8. The 5th rule reads as follows. In time of desolation, never make a change, but be firm and constant in the proposals and determination in which one was the day preceding such desolation, or in the determination in which one was in the preceding consolation. Because, as in consolation, the good spirit guides and counsels us more, so in desolation, the bad spirit, with whose counsels we cannot find the way to a right decision. The rule contains 2 parts. The first gives us a guideline, and the second explains the reason for that guideline. We'll examine the first guideline and the reason for it. Ignatius begins the rule by specifically specifying clearly in what precise situation the rule applies. This is a directive for persons who are in a time of desolation. As we have noted, experiences of spiritual desolation may vary in duration, a brief moment, an hour, a day, or weeks at a time. The norm given in this rule applies to persons who are now in such a time of spiritual desolation. The guideline is simple and absolute. In time of spiritual desolation, never make a change. In life, we make many changes on many different levels of our being and action, of which changes exactly is Ignatius speaking of here. As always in Discernment of Spirits, Ignatius has in view the spiritual life and what concerns it. These changes, then, will be the changes with direct pertinence to our life of faith and pursuit of God's will. For a proper understanding of Rule 5, and in order to avoid potentially harmful misapplications of Ignatius's counsel never to make changes in time of spiritual desolation, it is key to note clearly that Ignatius is speaking here of a time of spiritual desolation, not a time of non-spiritual desolation, and of not making changes in proposals regarding our spiritual life. This observation indicates once more a distinction between what is spiritual and what is non-spiritual must always be kept in mind for all correct discernment of spirits. If, for example, in a time of spiritual consolation, a man has proposed to spend some minutes a day reading and praying scripture, in a time of desolation, he will find himself moved to make a change. That is, to give up his earlier proposals and determination. He will be moved to abandon the practice of daily prayer with that scripture. The tactic of the enemy in the darkness of spiritual desolation is to suggest that we reverse the decisions taken in preceding times of light. Into this trap, says Ignatius, we must never fall. Rather, we must remain firm and constant in such proposals throughout the period of time we are in spiritual desolation. Spiritual desolation is a time that calls us to constancy and fidelity. In time of desolation, never make a change, quote unquote. The adverb is categorical, and the norm admits of no exceptions. In time of spiritual desolation, no change should ever be made to spiritual proposals decided before the spiritual desolation began. At times, dedicated persons may wonder whether they should or should not make certain changes in their previous decisions regarding prayer, the service of God, apostolic initiatives, and other aspects of their spiritual life. If they recognize that they are now in a time of spiritual desolation, then they need consider no further. In such a time, they should never change these earlier proposals. It is enough for them to know that they are in spiritual desolation, and all doubts regarding making such spiritual changes are resolved. Such changes should not be made. Frequently enough, committed people find themselves considering changes their faith life and pursuit of God's will. If they look within and perceive themselves to be in spiritual desolation, they then know that they should not make the change in question, but should remain firm and constant in their former decisions as long as the spiritual desolation endures. Such decisions range from small matters, like the woman deciding on whether to change a place and method of prayer already begun. Any such changes made in time of spiritual desolation will be harmful, as Ignatius will indicate the following rule. In time of spiritual desolation, we should never change our former spiritual decisions, but should work instead to change the spiritual desolation itself. When peace and spiritual consolation have returned, then questions of change may be profitably addressed. In his spiritual diary, Ignatius accounts an experience in which, in time of spiritual desolation, he is moved to change a decision already taken. It will permit a glimpse into the heart of Ignatius himself, as he too shares in our same spiritual struggle. In the early months of 1544, Ignatius was concerned with determining the manner of gospel poverty his Society of Jesus should embrace. He set aside 40 consecutive days to seek from God the clarity he would need regarding one specific issue of poverty. Whether, as with the current practice, the Society should accept fixed revenues for the churches it administered, or whether this practice constituted a departure from the full evangelical poverty that God willed on the Society. He decided to celebrate Mass on each of these 40 days, seeking light from God. In fact, over the course of 40 days, Ignatius clearly understood that the Lord did not want this exception to the Society's general practice of full gospel poverty. He received the answer he sought. Now, he has reached March 12th, the last of the 40 days, and is about to celebrate the final Mass. He is hoping to receive a spiritual consolation that will confirm the decision he has reached. And he writes, quote, "In the customary prayer, I felt great devotion. And from midway on, there was much of it, clear, lucid, and as it were, warm. Once in the chapel, as I saw some going down toward the stairway in a hurry and at a great pace, I did not feel ready to celebrate the Mass, and I returned to my room to prepare myself. Composing myself with tears, I returned to the chapel. During a part of the Mass, I felt great devotion, sometimes with movements to tears, and during the other part, I struggled many times with what I would do to finish, because I was not finding what I was seeking. When the Mass was finished and afterward in my room, I found myself totally alone and without help of any kind, without power to relish any of my mediators or any of the divine persons, but so remote and so separated from them, as if I had never felt anything of them, nor never would feel anything again. End quote. Unmistakable signs of spiritual desolation abound here. Alone in his room, Ignatius experiences a great sense of distance from God. He feels isolated, without help of any kind. The warmly devout prayer and the tears he earlier experienced have disappeared completely. Two additional qualities of spiritual desolation now appear and merit our close attention. The manner in which present spiritual desolation attempts to define the spiritual past and future as well, and the universal negatives directed toward self found in spiritual desolation. Remarkably, Ignatius's present spiritual desolation casts a shadow over both the past and the future. Quote, as if I had never felt anything of them or never would feel anything again. End quote. In the present heaviness of spiritual desolation, Ignatius, who has already experienced so deeply and so often the great love of the Lord, now reads his past in a different and falsified way. It now appears to him that he has never felt anything of God in the past, and he will never feel God's loving presence again in the future. Spiritual desolation claims power over the past and the future. It shows us a past without God and a future remorselessly bound in lasting desolation, a further characteristic of the deception of spiritual desolation is starkly evident here. The universal negatives of spiritual desolation are also worthy of note. I had never felt anything. I would never feel anything again, end quote. The negatives are universal both with respect to time, at no point in the past or in the future, and with respect to spiritual experience. Ignatius feels that he has never and never will feel even the slightest sense of God's closeness. Quote unquote. If he sees that we are weak and much humbled by these harmful thoughts, he goes on to suggest that we are entirely forgotten by God our Lord, and leads us to think that we are quite separated from him, and that all that we have done and all that we desire to do is entirely worthless. End quote. Quote, rather, thoughts came to me sometimes against Jesus, sometimes against another person, being so confused with different thoughts, such as to leave the house, to rent a room, to avoid the noise, or to attempt to fast, or to begin the masses over again, or to put the altar on a higher floor. In nothing could I find peace, since I desired to finish at a time when my soul was in consolation and completely at rest. End quote. Some of these thoughts are directed toward the persons of the Trinity and the persons who Ignatius most loves, and we can readily imagine the distress that such thoughts could cause him. Others of these thoughts suggest various changes as solutions to the heaviness of the moment, We enter here into the spiritual territory specifically contemplated by the fifth rule. One thought invites Ignatius to leave the house and rent a room to avoid the noise. This thought would have the leader of a community abandon the house of the community in order to overcome his inner tremble. A second thought prompts Ignatius to attempt a fast, another change of spiritual nature. It is striking that yet another thought proposes that he began the masses over again. And on this 40th day, Ignatius has completed the sequence of masses seeking God's will and has received his answer clearly. Now, as Ignatius is on the verge of concluding this process as planned, and in a time of spiritual desolation, a thought arises suggesting that the entire process has been a failure and should be completely redone. The final thought is a milder version of the first. To move the chapel to a place of greater quiet within the house. As these different thoughts pass through his mind, Ignatius summarized the statement of his heart: "In nothing could I find peace." Quote. In the concluding sentence of Rule 5, Ignatius explains the reason for the categorical never regarding changes in time of spiritual desolation. Quote unquote. Because as in consolation the good spirit guides and counsels us more, so in desolation the bad spirit, whose counsels we cannot find the way to a right decision. End quote. In Rule 4, Ignatius underlined the conceptual element that accompanies the effective experience of spiritual consolation and desolation. Quote, "For just as consolation is contrary to desolation, in the same way the thoughts that come from consolation are contrary to the thoughts that come from desolation. Thoughts arise of each of these two spiritual movements, and like the movements themselves, are directly contrary to each other." Here in Rule 5, Ignatius further explains, quote unquote, "In consolation, the good spirit guides and counsels us more, whereas in desolation, the bad spirit guides and counsels us more." During spiritual consolation, the good spirit is guiding and counseling us. The time of spiritual consolation is thus the time to accept the work of God, to be open, to listen, to receive the thoughts and inspirations arising from the consolation itself. When new spiritual steps are necessary, this is the time to review our earlier proposals and make spiritual changes. In times of spiritual desolation, however, the bad spirit is at work with whom and whose counsels we cannot find the way to a right decision. End quote. There are counsels too in time of spiritual desolation. But however, when the enemy counsels, quote unquote, we cannot find the way to a right decision. It is difficult to exaggerate the good this single rule has worked in the lives of countless dedicated persons over the centuries since Ignatius formulated it. At times it will be the one light that shines in the confusing darkness, revealing clearly the call of the Lord to unchanging fidelity in a time of spiritual desolation. Knowledge and practical application of this guiding will bless us repeatedly on our own spiritual journey. Well, I hope you enjoyed that chapter. Boy, so many times in this book, already, The Discernment of Spirits, an Ignation Guide for Everyday Living by Father Timothy Gallager. If you don't have it, pick it up on Amazon, pick it up on eBay, your local bookstore. They've got it on Kindle too. This is powerful. And I cannot tell you enough that you do not have to be a formation director. You do not have to be somebody that's considering the diaconate or maybe entering into an order. You have to desire to do the will of God. And sadly, in this world, we have a lot of opposing spirits that are constantly coming at us from all sides. So let's just take a step back here. All right? Because although this book is directed toward people that are so much more holier than me, this book is good for each and every one of us. We want to do God's will. And hopefully, if you're here looking at Swords of St. Michael, you're looking at how can I learn to discern spirits? Because truly, this is one of those tools in your arsenal. As at the end of this chapter just pointed out, we are going to be so thankful and get so much knowledge and so much solid confidence by practicing just what this one chapter just went over and over and over and over. It's those times when we feel so spiritually excited and so spiritually consoled that we've got to hold on to that. We've got to hold on to our inspirations, and we've got to think, wow, this is wonderful. That's the time, when we're in a time of spiritual consolation, that we may make changes in our spiritual life, in our spiritual progress, in our spiritual... We may make the changes appropriate to that time that we're undergoing. However, as in now, in this chapter, in Rule 5, we have to look at this desolation when we are without peace, when we are being attacked, our faith is being attacked, our love of God is being attacked, our desire to pray the rosary, pray a holy hour, to attend Mass more often, to volunteer, to lead up a prayer group. We have to look at desolation as multiple voices dissuading us and redirecting us away from God and showing us in our minds that there's literally no past. God never loved you. God never called you to do what you were supposed to do. God never told you, you could run these committees and help out at church. God never told you, and you're just wasting your time, and people don't appreciate you, and this is ridiculous, and this is pride, and this is vainglory. You will have 1,000,001 voices in your head continually mapping out and framing this desolation, begging you to stop volunteering, stop your prayer life, stop going to Mass, stop doing those things that feed your soul. So this is pretty in your face. And when we think about the dark night of the soul, when we think about how it might feel to have a period of time where there is no peace, and in our lives as mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, however it is we contribute in the lives of others, in the lives of our church, in our offices that we serve, we never make a change when we don't feel peace. We never make that change. We continue with our rosaries. We continue with our auxilium Christian orders. We continue with our holy hours. We continue with our Mass. We don't stop what we're doing, no matter how we feel, no matter how down we are, or how worthless we are, or how, whatever those lying words are, you need to bind them away and kick them away. Let's look at a couple things that I pointed out that we might think about while we may experience this period of spiritual desolation here. Now, in the Discernment of Spirits notes, I like to take some notes as I pray about these lessons that we're reading and we're trying to absorb and we're trying to learn. And I try and look at our experience as a collective as we're growing together and we're doing this together. And I thank you so much for joining me on this journey. And I'm hoping if you like this, you'll give us a thumbs up, click on that little bell and subscribe to the channel, okay? And share it with someone. And this Discernment of Spirits this week, for those of you that have been following along, pull out your journals and let's write this down. Because I think when we're trying to look at something or we're trying to learn something new, whether it is a pattern for maybe making an Afghan, or maybe we're learning how to play a new game such as, cribbage, football, whatever we're trying to do, sometimes the best way we can learn is not only just watch it, but we can write it down and then we practice it. And that's kind of how I like to do things. I like to, watch, read, look, and write things down so that it commits to my memory and it helps me see things on a little bit of a different perspective. And that's what I'm hoping to give you guys. So in this number 1 that I wrote down, how can we address, when we enter into a period of spiritual desolation, and we've identified it as so because it's not any other kind of emotional desolation or non-spiritual desolation that has to do with other relationships in our lives and other events in our lives. This has to do with our seeking God's will. Big difference. So when we're addressing this period of spiritual desolation, maybe we can diagram it. Does anybody remember diagramming from English class and how you take the noun and the verb and the adverb and the present participle and all that stuff? Kind of different, but kind of the same, in the sense that if we have a diagram of what we were doing yesterday. So let's say today I'm in spiritual desolation and I don't feel like going to Mass. I don't feel like making the calls for the prayer team that, to get people praying. And I don't want to do it. I know I can call somebody else to do it. Somebody else can do it better. Somebody else has got a much more outgoing personality. Somebody can do it much better than me because they're happier and I'm kind of crabbing. I got a lot going on. I'm doing this and that. And you give yourself 1,000 excuses. Now, the way to discern this is to take a look. What were you doing yesterday spiritually? Spiritually, you were on board, you had made the decision, this is what you were going to do, this is how you're going to donate your time, and you were totally happy with it. That's one thing. Second thing, what are the voices causing you, and what are the exterior effects that are causing you to think, I can't do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do God's will, I don't want to do what I said I wanted to do spiritually? Are you tired? Are you sick? Do you have family that is just literally in your face and you have to deal with things? Do you have external things that are moving you away from doing what you need to do because the demands that they're creating and your lack of ability to say no? That's not spiritual desolation. That's non-spiritual desolation. Because something that is demanding attention, such as us learning to say no and create boundaries, is interfering with our ability to love and know God and follow through with the things that we planned to do yesterday. And it's not always easy. Boundaries are not always easy, especially when it comes to people we love. So determining if it's truly spiritual desolation is going to take some focused attention, some time, and truly a long look at the externals in our life that may be pulling us one way or another, maybe giving us excuses not to do what we know we need to do. So it's important that we really think about this, really pray, and begin to know ourselves enough to identify what these are on paper. What are the real reasons? Let's write this in our journal. So, and number 2, I thought this was really important because a lot of us, when we go through any times of desolation or anxiousness or feeling away, alone, apart from people, we look at people we love and we like to crab at, like our parents or our spouses or our kids, and we call them blah, 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 and we just dump all this garbage on them. That's not a help. What I'm talking about here is not calling to complain. I'm talking about writing down and finding 2 to 3 people that you have confidence in, whether it is a pastor, whether it is a nun, whether it is a priest, whether it is someone that you know from your prayer group, whether it's somebody that you know from Bible study that has your confidence, will not share what you're talking to them about, and that you know does their best to lead a holy life. Because if somebody isn't going to where you want to go, you do not want to take your pain and your desolation to somebody that cannot identify and cannot help you. That's a waste. So let's pray about 2 to 3 people that you can confidently call and lay out a scenario to help you in this discernment of spirits. Because I think it's going to be important in the future to know who these people are, who we can count on, who we can depend on, who we know may be just the right balance of listening without telling us what to do, but reflecting back what it is that we may not be seeing. That is the importance here. So, as always, thank you so much for joining us here at Swords of St. Michael. We are the spiritual warfare, healing, deliverance, exorcism channel that is hopefully helping you win the spiritual fight and win it right. If you'd like to contribute and support us, there's all sorts of links below, Patreon, PayPal, etc. We have books listed on our swordsofstmichael.org, on Etsy, or on Prayers by the Bead. You can buy a new religious devotional, Episcopal rosary, that sort of thing. Saint devotional. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate all the comments, all the private messages, and everything else. Please drop a comment, give us a like. God bless you, and never forget, never, never, never forget, God's love and His Holy Spirit is greater than anything that is in this world. Take care. Until next week, God bless and good night.